This is a story about the biggest theft in American history, and how this theft dooms 97% of Americans to a lifetime of slavery and fear. This theft occurred in 1913 with the creation of the United States Federal Reserve, otherwise known for short as the Fed. This theft is ongoing and actually accelerating in speed. This is a criminal enterprise that goes way beyond any James Bond movie plot. The man behind the creation of the Fed was J.P. Morgan and his cartel of bankers. And J.P. Morgan, of course, was the most famous banker in America's history. The plot to hatch the Fed occurred in a 10-day secret meeting of this cartel of bankers on a remote island off the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island. 5 of the 7 who met controlled 25% of the world's wealth at that time. Also in this meeting was the longtime chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Nelson Aldrich, who is also the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. His daughter was married to John D. Rockefeller Jr. Senator Aldrich was also the sponsor of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave us the direct federal income tax. So this was a senator who did enormous damage. He was also a Republican and leader of the progressive wing of the Republican Party. For the most part, Democrats in that day opposed the creation of any kind of national bank or central bank. Also opposed the income tax. It's amazing how politics has just completely flipped between the parties. Now, the Democrats weren't good either. The Democrats are the party of slavery. But the Republicans were the party of the banking class and the progressives. Both parties basically sucked, but for different reasons. And both parties basically suck today. Now, I'm a registered Republican because I think the Republican Party is better than the Democrat Party today. My basic view is that at least the Republican Party is not actively trying to destroy the country today. The Democrat Party, on the other hand, does appear to be actively trying to destroy the country. But as I'll demonstrate here, it really doesn't matter all that much which party is in power, because the real power over the economy rests with the Fed, the United States Federal Reserve, which is not actually an agency of government. The Fed is actually a cartel of bankers who have been given the power of government. The president and Congress are almost irrelevant. The power over the economy resides with the Fed because whoever controls the money supply pretty much controls everything. The United States Federal Reserve, or the Fed, was the product of this secret meeting on Jekyll Island in 1910 among this cartel of 5 of America's most powerful bankers. And this secret 10-day meeting was organized by J.P. Morgan. He assembled America's 5 most powerful bankers and brought in the most powerful U.S. senator over finance matters, Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose job was to ram this proposal through the U.S. Senate and Congress. Now, J.P. Morgan himself was not in attendance at this meeting. That would have attracted a lot of media attention. But all 7 men at this meeting were controlled by J.P. Morgan or John D. Rockefeller, and their job was to hatch the plot. Much of the material about this meeting comes from a great book titled The Creature from Jekyll Island by Edward Griffin. This is a big book, 608 pages, so I'll summarize the key details here. It's also worth noting here that in 2010, the Federal Reserve held a celebration on Jekyll Island to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Fed on Jekyll Island. So this is no conspiracy theory. The Fed considers this meeting on Jekyll Island in 1910 the founding of the Fed. And we'll get back to Jekyll Island in a moment. But first, let's talk about the impact of this meeting and why you should care. Because the impact of this meeting is still being felt today, is actually being felt more than ever. The banking cartel led by J.P. Morgan, also John D. Rockefeller, that planned and launched the Fed in 1910, dooms 97% of the American people to a lifetime of slavery and fear. Consider this. When the U.S. went off the gold standard completely in 1971, the price of 1 ounce of gold was $35. Today, as I speak to you here, the price of 1 ounce of gold is $1,426. This means the dollar has lost 98.6% of its value since 1971. The price of an average car today is $48,000. If the U.S. had remained on the gold standard, this same car would cost $700. Let that sink in. Now, actually, the price of an average car in 1971 was $3,400. However, because advances in technology and manufacturing has a deflationary effect, prices should be going down 2 to 3% per year if we had not gone off the gold standard in 1971. At the start of 2020, the median price of a home in America was $208,000. Today, this same house costs $412,000. So the cost of housing has doubled in just 4 years because of fiat money printing by the Fed. And I don't have to tell you about how the cost of living has exploded, how what used to be a $200 trip to the grocery store is now a $400 trip to the grocery store, how $2 gas is now $4 gas, etc., etc. All because we went off the gold standard in 1971. Well, also because of insane spending by Democrats. But of course, Republicans do plenty of spending too. So why did we go off the gold standard? Well, for the simple reason that the government wants to print as much money as it wants no limits on how much money the government can print. The Fed is the world's biggest money counterfeiting operation. It's organized crime, pure and simple. It's also unconstitutional and illegal, as we'll see later in this video. The reason the government wanted to get off the gold standard and move to a 100% fiat money printing system is because raising taxes is politically unpopular. It's hard to get tax increases through Congress. Government much prefers to be able to just print as much money as it wants and take it out of your money in the form of inflation, take it out of your purchasing power. And this is counterfeiting, which is theft. Counterfeiting money has always been considered among the most serious crimes there is. Counterfeiting used to be a death penalty offense. Counterfeiting is considered an attack on civilization. Yet the U.S. Federal Reserve, an agent of the U.S. government, is printing up trillions of new dollars every year and just dumping these dollars on the U.S. economy. And this obviously erodes the purchasing power of the dollars that you have earned with your hard work. So much so that the dollar has lost 98.6% of its value since we went off the gold standard in 1971. Again, let that sink in. That is effectively 100% taxation. But this tax falls almost entirely on wage earners and those on fixed incomes. Now, inflation doesn't really hit the top 1% or the top 3%. Actually, inflation helps the top 3%. It doesn't hit someone like me because once I've covered my cost of living, I have enough excess cash left over that I can invest in a stock market index fund, or in gold, or in real estate, or in Bitcoin. My real estate holdings have doubled in price since 2019. My stock market holdings are up 180% in 5 years. Bitcoin is up about 800% in 5 years. And about 10% of my wealth is in Bitcoin. I'll talk more about that later. So inflation in the Fed's money printing press is great for someone like me, great for the top 1%, but it's effectively 100% taxation over time for wage earners and those on a fixed income. Because wage increases don't come close to keeping up with inflation, don't come close to being able to stay ahead of the Fed's money printing press, the Fed's counterfeiting operation. Now, I don't worry too much about the price of groceries. I don't even check prices when I'm at the grocery store. But the doubling of price of a bag of groceries is a big deal for 97% of Americans. The Fed's money printing press is a giant wealth transfer program from lower income Americans and the middle class to the top 3% of wealthiest Americans. And by the way, do you know that politicians really don't care at all about the $35 trillion national debt, soon to be $100 trillion? They don't care about the national debt because the government can just print up whatever money it needs to cover the interest payments on the national debt. Now, of course, this can't continue forever. Right now, interest payments alone on the national debt amount to more than $1 trillion per year, which is more than we spend on national defense. Interest payments on the national debt are the second biggest expenditure in the federal budget, exceeded only by Social Security, and barely behind Social Security. By the end of 2024, interest payments on the national debt will surpass Social Security and will be the single biggest expenditure in the federal budget. And it won't be long before there will be no room in the federal budget for national defense, Social Security, Medicare, law enforcement, roads and infrastructure, and all the things Americans expect government to do. And it won't be long before we're like the German Weimar Republic, which produced Adolf Hitler. Or we become like Venezuela, which has a 1,000% annual inflation rate. Or we become some other variant of a totalitarian Orwellian nightmare. And think about how life has changed in America since we went off the gold standard in 1971. Now, many of you, of course, won't remember this because you were not alive yet, but I remember it. And let me describe it to you. When I was a kid in the 1960s and 1970s, most families had one income earner. Moms typically stayed home to raise the kids. One income for a family was enough. Also, if you were in the middle class, you expected to retire at age 65. You could expect to live comfortably on your savings, getting 4 to 5% return on your savings. Most people back then did not invest in stocks, which were considered very high risk. If you wanted to be super risky, your investment portfolio might be 60% AAA bonds and government bonds and 40% stocks. Perhaps a Dow Jones Industrial Average index of stocks or an S&P 500 index of stocks. And this would be considered pretty risky. Most retirees were happy with 4 to 5% return on their savings plus Social Security. This combo allowed most retirees to live just fine. Today, it's almost impossible for 97% of Americans to retire because we have no idea what the cost of tomorrow will be. If you have $5 million saved up, is that enough to retire? Well, you would think so. If you take 4% per year out from your $5 million, well, that's $200,000 a year in income. Then what you hope for is that stock market appreciation will allow you to keep your $5 million nest egg intact so that you can continue to take out 4% and take out $200,000 a year, and so that you don't have to suffer a decline in your standard of living. And for that to work, the stock market has to keep going up. We also have no idea how fast the government will run its money printing press to keep up with exploding interest payments on the national debt, while also covering the always increasing cost of government. Government spending always goes up, never goes down, which means the government's money printing press will just continue running at faster and faster speed. So $200,000 in retirement income might sound like enough today. But how will that look 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now? People are living into their 90s. $200,000 today might be only worth $10,000 in 10 years at the rate the government is printing money. And the government will just continue to print money at faster and faster speeds every year. So your $200,000 in retirement income might be worth almost nothing in 10 or 15 years. And it's of course not unusual for the stock market to have 50% declines in a year. But we really have no choice but to invest in the stock market if we want to stay ahead of the money printing press. We really need at least 10% returns from the stock market every year on average just to stay even with the Fed's money printing press. And we actually need 20% annual returns from the stock market in order to justify the risk of being in the stock market. Because remember, it's not uncommon for the stock market to decline 50% in a year. In the 1950s and 1960s, this would be an unimaginable risk to be taking with your life savings. But we really have no choice today because of the Fed's money printing press. Now also, the government lies about the true rate of inflation with its monthly report on inflation called the Consumer Price Index Report. The government is always changing the composition of the Consumer Price Index, and therefore changing the way it measures inflation. If the government was measuring inflation the same way it was measuring inflation in 1980, inflation is actually running 5 to 6% higher than the inflation rate that the government now reports. And you can know for sure that this is true simply by tracking the price of gold over the years, or by tracking the price of silver, oil, real estate, lumber, other commodities and assets over the years, and then comparing the price increases of these commodities and assets to the government's official inflation rate report, as measured by CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So the government lies about the true inflation rate every month. And I'm sure you already know this from your experience at the grocery store. The reason the government wants to lie about the inflation rate, wants to report an artificially low inflation rate, is that the government wants to shortchange Social Security recipients of their cost of living adjustment. Social Security is the biggest item in the federal budget, $1.5 trillion in 2024. The government also wants to pay artificially lower interest rates on the national debt. And plus, the president and the party in power want to report a lower inflation rate than the true inflation rate. And there are many other reasons that the government wants to report an artificially low inflation rate every month. So the government issues a false inflation report every month that understates true inflation by 5 to 6%. In addition to this, advances in technology, robotics, and manufacturing should be pushing prices down 2 to 3% per year if we had honest money. So that's another 2 to 3% that the government is stealing from you with its fiat money printing press. Your groceries should be getting cheaper every year due to advances in farming technology, robotics, better fertilizers, and so forth, mass production. Yet grocery prices keep going up. Almost everything should be getting cheaper every year, but everything keeps getting more expensive. Housing, gasoline, energy, food, water, electricity, everything that you need to live gets more expensive. So let's add it up. Let's say the official government reported inflation rate is 3.6%, but this understates the real inflation rate by 5%. Then we should be having 2 to 3% price reductions in most things because of advances in technology and better manufacturing. So that's at least 10% of your money that the government is stealing from you every year with its fiat money printing press, with its counterfeiting operation. And again, this effectively amounts to 100% taxation over time for wage earners and those living on a fixed income. So wage earners become poorer and poorer, effectively become slaves. And more people are holding down 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet. And of course, retirement for 97% of Americans is now out of the question. You basically work until you die. So the Fed's money printer is why we have such a big wealth gap in America today. We have some people in America who are worth $100 billion and even $200 billion. People like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, worth $100 billion, $200 billion. We saw nothing like this concentration of wealth in the hands of a few people in the 1950s and 1960s before we went off the gold standard completely in 1971. But if you're not in the top 10% of income earners in America now, you're probably struggling. Well, if you're earning $200,000 a year, that puts you at the edge of the top 10% in America. And you might need 2 incomes to produce this if you're a married couple. Now, this sounded like a nice income 5 years ago, but this is barely enough today to cover your bills if you live in a single-family home. The median home price now being $412,000, instead of $208,000 it was 4 years ago. To stay in this house, you will need to pay property taxes and insurance. These costs alone will be $20,000 a year probably, depending on where you live. If you have a mortgage, tack on another $3,000 a month or $36,000 a year. Then there are house repairs and maintenance. Your federal income tax on $200,000 would be about $62,000 a year, plus your Social Security and Medicare tax. And you'll probably have a state income tax too, unless you're living in Florida or Texas or 6 other states that don't have a state income tax. So now you're down to around $70,000 or $80,000 a year that you have to spend on living, and we haven't covered the cost of your car yet, your car insurance, gas, groceries, cable, tech costs, electricity, utilities, clothing. Then you might want to go out to dinner and a movie once a week. So then your money's pretty much gone. Then there's almost no money left for savings and investing in your 401k or IRA retirement plan. Then if you have kids, you're basically screwed financially if you're only bringing in $200,000 a year. That's the financial condition you are in if you are at the edge of the top 10% of income earners in America. But your financial situation is far more dire if you're not in the top 10%. 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. 58% of Americans do not have $1,000 in the bank to cover unexpected expenses, such as a car repair. That's just shocking and horrifying to me. America is now effectively a third world country for more than half the people, with a very small sliver of super rich at the top. This is why people are not having kids anymore. It's why people aren't getting married. It's why adults who are in their 30s and 40s are still living in their parents' basement. But this wasn't the situation in the 1950s and 1960s when families could get by fine on one income. Here's what life was like for me as a kid. And I was not from a wealthy family at all. I would call us middle class, maybe slightly upper middle class. Basically middle class. My father was a professor at Dartmouth College. As a full professor at Dartmouth in 1971, he was earning an annual salary of $17,000. $17,000 per year. And he bought our house for $21,000. And this was a beautiful 5-bedroom house up on a hill overlooking the Pompanoosik River in Vermont. And my mom would stay at home. She never worked a day in her life professionally. We had 10 acres of land. We had 5 horses, 2 dogs, a whole menagerie of pets and animals. And on a hill, which was part of our 10 acres of land, we installed a ski lift with lights for night skiing. I was a top-level junior ski racer back then. And lots of kids from the neighborhood would practice ski racing on our hill after school until well into the night, sometimes till 10 p.m., because we had lights for night skiing. And in fact, a kid who lived just down the street from us was named Felix McGrath. He would practice on that hill every day and night after school, and he would go on to become the #1 slalom racer in America. That was the life my dad was able to pay for with a $17,000 a year salary from Dartmouth College. And that was before America went off the gold standard. Zillow says that same house is worth $1.3 million today. And by the way, I did notice that we were experiencing a noticeable decline in our standard of living after 1971, after we went off the gold standard and the government's fiat money printing press started ramping up. So going off the gold standard was a frontal attack on the middle class. Meanwhile, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos have become two of the biggest landowners in the United States. Bill Gates has quietly bought up an estimated 270,000 acres of American farmland. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos has bought up 420,000 acres of American land. And some speculate that Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos want to control America's food supply. That's why it seems they're buying up all this farmland. So America is rapidly becoming a kind of high-tech feudal society, with the government money printing press as one of the key mechanisms for carrying out this transformation of American society, where the mega-rich just keep getting richer and richer, with everyone else just getting crumbs from the kitchen table. Meanwhile, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, and Big Tech have set up this digital prison to keep the masses under control. What Big Tech is doing in partnership with Big Government is setting up a push-button totalitarian system. With a push of a button, the government, with an assist from Big Tech, will be able to turn off your money. And this is already happening. China, for example, is already rolling out programmable money, which can only be spent in certain ways that the regime wants. And you can be certain that this is coming to the United States soon. So government will be able to turn off your money and will be able to program your money. And you'll only be able to spend your money in ways approved by the government. And Big Tech, of course, is an arm of the government. You could say that Big Tech in many ways is the government now. It's become so powerful. The government is the biggest customer of Google, Amazon, Microsoft. The CIA effectively capitalized Google. Google would not be Google without the CIA. Big Tech also controls the politicians with money and manipulates elections with its algorithms. And of course, you can see that the search results on Google are just insanely biased. And I'll get into that in more detail in another video, because that's another element of social control. But the first and probably the single most important element for setting up a totalitarian structure was for government and the banks to control the money supply. Because whoever controls your money controls you. But this is also a big part of how those who control the money supply get so rich. Think about it, those who have a money printing press can get as rich as they want. There's no limit to how rich you can get if you have a money printing press. If you had a money printer in your basement, you could get rich too, assuming you could escape the legal consequences. And this is a big part of how these bankers got so rich, because remember, money equals power, and power can also be converted to money. Whoever has the money has the power, and whoever has the power has a way to get as much money as they want. And this was the whole point of going off the gold standard in 1971. This heist and power grab had been in the works for many decades, starting with that secret meeting at Jekyll Island in 1910, a 10-day meeting of 5 of America's most powerful bankers, organized and hosted by J.P. Morgan. Now let's unpack this criminal enterprise some more, what I call the origin of the money supply cartel. The Jekyll Island Club was founded in 1866 by J.P. Morgan, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, and America's most powerful bankers, financiers, and industrialists. So who was J.P. Morgan? Well, he was the most famous banker in American history. He also reorganized several major railroads and financed industrial consolidations that formed U.S. Steel, International Harvester, and General Electric corporations. He was so rich that he was able to bail out the U.S. economy during the financial panics of 1893 and 1907 because the U.S. government could not afford to and didn't know how. Morgan was then able to scoop up depressed assets in the process. That's how you get rich. You buy low and then pretty much never sell. Forget selling high. Buy low and hold. J.P. Morgan learned his financial skills from his father, and became an agent for his dad's banking company in 1861 in New York City. Young J.P. Morgan also developed extensive financial connections in the London financial world, in the orbit of the Rothschild family, and was able to secure capital from the Rothschilds and other financial sources in London in the 1870s to fuel the industrialization of the United States. He reorganized the New York Central Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Southern Railroad, Erie Railroad, the Northern Pacific Railroad, and ended up controlling about 5,000 miles of railroads in the United States by 1902. He financed the creation of the Federal Steel Company in 1898, then merged it with Carnegie Steel to create the mammoth U.S. Steel Corporation. During the Depression of 1893, Morgan formed a syndicate that resupplied the U.S. government's depleted gold reserves to bail out the U.S. Treasury. He called his syndicate the Money Trust. During the 1907 financial crisis, his Money Trust took an enormous sums of money from the federal government, and then he decided how this money would be doled out to troubled banks and corporations to prevent their collapse. And as part of this, J.P. Morgan gained control over a number of America's largest banks, financial institutions, and major corporations. J.P. Morgan effectively was America's central bank. In terms of finances, he almost was the government. So that's who J.P. Morgan was. J.P. Morgan Chase's stock market valuation today is $850 billion. So J.P. Morgan set up this secret 10-day meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia in November of 1910 that produced the plan for the Federal Reserve System that we have today. And the Jekyll Island Club that was founded by J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, was described by Munsey's magazine in 1904 as the richest, most exclusive, most inaccessible club in the world. And this now famous secret meeting was disguised as a duck hunt, so as not to draw media attention. Again, J.P. Morgan himself did not attend this meeting of 7 people. That would have drawn too much media attention. But his key people were there. People at this meeting included Henry P. Davidson, who was a senior partner of J.P. Morgan, Charles D. Norton, who was the president of the J.P. Morgan-controlled First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, who was vice president of the J.P. Morgan-controlled Bankers Trust of New York, Paul Warburg, who was a partner at Kuhn and Loeb, which was part of the Rockefeller orbit. He was also a director at Wells Fargo. Frank A. Vanderlip, who was president of the Rockefeller-controlled National City Bank of New York, which was renamed Citibank in the 1970s. This group of 5 bankers represented 25% of the world's wealth, just to give you an idea of the concentration of wealth and power at this secret 10-day meeting on Jekyll Island. Also at this meeting was the powerful U.S. Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was a close ally and friend of John D. Rockefeller. Aldrich was also the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. He served in the U.S. Senate for 30 years and was the most powerful member of Congress in matters of finance and U.S. economic policy. Senator Aldrich would be the one introducing the plan into the U.S. Senate that they came up with at Jekyll Island to establish the Federal Reserve. And also, J.P. Morgan's Jekyll Island group did not call their plan a proposal for a central bank or a national bank. And that's very important because that would have ensured certain defeat for the scheme. Most Americans were very much against a central bank, very much against any kind of a national bank. Europe had central banks. America had not had a national bank since Alexander Hamilton's national bank was dissolved in 1836. More on that in a moment. At that time, most Americans knew that giving bankers control over the U.S. economy meant giving bankers the power and a license to loot and pillage the American people at will. J.P. Morgan being the most famous robber baron of them all. So instead of a central bank, it would be called the United States Federal Reserve, even though there would be no reserve. The Federal Reserve would just print up money as needed. No reserve. Senator Aldrich's job was to get the Jekyll Island proposal for a central bank passed into law. Also in attendance at this meeting was economist and Harvard professor A. Piatt Andrew. He had written extensively arguing for the need for a central bank in America, similar to what countries in Europe had, and continue to have. And J.P. Morgan's banking cartel, of course, needed academic justification for this plan. So that was Harvard professor Andrew's role. J.P. Morgan essentially wanted to pull off in America what Nathan Rothschild pulled off in early 19th century England. Nathan Rothschild effectively controlled the Bank of England. And he said this in 1815, quote, "I care not what puppet is placed on the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." By the end of the 19th century, the Rothschild family controlled about half the world's wealth. The Rothschilds owned 41 palaces. England relied on Nathan Rothschild to fund England's wars against Napoleon. That's how rich he was. Nathan's father, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, I think that's how you pronounce it, maybe not how you pronounce it, he launched the Rothschild banking empire in Frankfurt, Germany in the 1760s. Nathan's brothers and subsequent Rothschild generations expanded the Rothschild financial empire across Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Rothschild dynasty effectively controlled Europe's national banks, also funded wars, very profitably I might add, and of course controlled the politicians. Money equals power, and power equals money. The Rothschild dynasty declined largely due to World War I and World War II, plus less than optimal management by fourth-generation Rothschilds. The Rothschilds also never established a beachhead in the United States, but they did help fund J.P. Morgan's enterprises. And J.P. Morgan wanted to replicate what the Rothschilds had done in Europe here in America. Senator Nelson Aldrich had also traveled to Europe to study Europe's central banks. So he very much wanted the United States to have a central bank. And remember, Senator Nelson Aldrich also sponsored the 16th Amendment to the Constitution that gave us the direct federal income tax, which was ratified in 1913, the same year that the Federal Reserve was established. Before this, the U.S. government was funded by excises, duties, and tariffs on imported goods. So Senator Nathan Aldrich was basically an all-round bad guy. Caused a lot of damage. To establish a central bank in the United States was the purpose of this meeting at Jekyll Island in 1910. But it would not be called a central bank. And it's actually not a bank in the usual sense. The Federal Reserve is actually a cartel of bankers. It's an organized crime syndicate. And this cartel involves monopoly control over the U.S. money supply. And the 7 participants in this meeting were required to go to almost comical lengths to keep this meeting a secret. They were to arrive by train one at a time in their own private car and using fake names. And for decades, this group called themselves the First Name Club because they were only to refer to each other by their first names, never last names, such as just by Nelson or Charles or Frank. And they would leave the island 10 days later the same way, one at a time, traveling by private train car and under fake names. 6 years after this meeting, an investigative journalist named B.C. Forbes wrote an investigative article in 1916 about this meeting on Jekyll Island. And it's actually a pretty funny article to read. Forbes' article appeared in the magazine that he founded, Forbes magazine, which was once a great business publication. Now today, Forbes magazine is just another fake news publication written mostly by 24-year-old wokesters who know nothing about business or economics. Forbes has become pathetic today, but it was once a great magazine. And Forbes described this Jekyll Island meeting as, quote, the strangest, most secretive expedition in the history of American finance, and the real birth of the Federal Reserve System. And most of the details of this meeting contained in that article in 1916, in the Forbes article, have been confirmed by participants in that meeting. But by the time this article appeared in 1916, the Federal Reserve was already established, had been established by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So too late, the Federal Reserve was already set up. I've been on Jekyll Island. It's a beautiful place. I've eaten at the Jekyll Island Club, sat in the very area where this cabal of banking titans planned their fleecing of America. The plan they came up with at Jekyll Island is essentially the Federal Reserve System that we have today. Senator Aldrich introduced the Jekyll Island Plan in the U.S. Senate. Under this plan, the U.S. Federal Reserve would be the only institution authorized to issue currency, and there would be one and only one currency. Previously, any bank could issue currency, gold or silver certificates, so long as backed up by gold and silver reserves on hand. Now, the original plan from Jekyll Island was shot down initially because under the Jekyll Island Plan, the plan that they came up with, executives of America's banks would appoint the Board of Governors, which meant that J.P. Morgan would be appointing the Board of Governors. This would be like the fox guarding the chicken coop. This would put J.P. Morgan and his cartel of bankers in charge of the U.S. money supply. which means in charge of the financial system and the U.S. economy, and accountable to no one. And their decrees would have the force of government. Congressional hearings on the J.P. Morgan and Jekyll Island plan concluded that J.P. Morgan, effectively had a banking monopoly and controlled Wall Street. Also found that officers of J.P. Morgan held board positions on 112 of America's largest corporations, which accounted for 85% of the market cap of all the companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So Congress initially rejected the plan from Jekyll Island. It just made no sense that the banks would be running the U.S. Federal Reserve and setting U.S. monetary policy. And there were lots of cartoons in newspapers at that time on this theme mocking Aldrich's proposal. However, a modified version of the Jekyll Island plan was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And this turns out to be a fateful day in American history. The only difference with the revised Jekyll Island proposal was that the President of the United States would appoint the Fed's Board of Governors, not banking executives. There would be 7 members of the Board of Governors, each serving 14-year terms. All other elements of the Jekyll Island plan remained pretty much intact. And 2 of the 7 members of the Board of Governors of the initial Board of Governors were participants in the meeting at Jekyll Island, one being Benjamin Strong, who had been president of Bankers Trust, which was controlled by J.P. Morgan, and another was Paul Warburg, who was a director at Wells Fargo, also a partner at the enormous investment bank called Kuhn Loeb, which was part of the Rockefeller orbit. And Paul Warburg was very influential in putting together the plan for the Federal Reserve. He wrote about the need for an elastic money. An elastic money. Warburg was an immigrant from Germany. He wanted to bring the German central banking system to the United States. Well, we saw how well that worked in Germany, with the Weimar Republic and 10,000% inflation, which gave us Adolf Hitler and 50 million dead people in World War II. So the German central bank system didn't work out so well. But Warburg, J.P. Morgan, and this Jekyll Island banking cartel wanted that system for us. And it turns out that just because the president appoints the Fed's Board of Governors instead of banks appointing the Board of Governors, which was the original Jekyll Island plan, that doesn't mean this worked out badly for the bankers, especially big banks like J.P. Morgan. They did just fine under this arrangement, just not quite as well as they would have liked to have done. Because the way newly printed money is injected into the economy is through the banks. What banks do is borrow money from the Fed at a discounted interest rate. The banks then lend this money out at a higher interest rate. So that's one way banks earn money. Another way is what's called the Cantillon effect. This effect describes how those who receive the newly issued money first have a near automatic arbitrage advantage over everyone else. Banks can take this newly printed money that they've received from the Fed at a discounted interest rate and buy assets that will appreciate in value when measured against the dollar when the newly issued money floods the economy, before the inflation hits. That's where the arbitrage advantage comes in. So creating the Federal Reserve was step 1 in creating a fiat money printing system. But it still wasn't 100% fiat money printing because the dollar was still pegged to the price of gold. 1 ounce of gold cost $20.67. The Coinage Act of 1792 had set the price of gold at $19.39 per ounce. So there had been slight adjustments to the price of gold, I think to pay debts from the War of 1812 with Great Britain and the Civil War. So at the time of the passing of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the price of 1 ounce of gold was $20.67, and the dollar was still pegged to the price of gold. So the Fed just couldn't print as much money as the bankers wanted. The U.S. population was increasing rapidly, so new money had to be created all the time to keep up with population growth, so as to keep the price of gold at $20.67 an ounce. So plenty of new money was being created and given to the banks, which would then lend it out. It was still a very sweet deal for the banks, but it would be even better for the banks if we could just get off the gold standard entirely. If unlimited money could just be printed, with no restraints whatsoever. Now, prior to 1933, U.S. money were gold or silver certificates, convertible to gold or silver. You could actually show up at a bank window and get gold coins or silver coins in return for your paper money, in return for your gold or silver certificates. And here's what the U.S. Constitution says about money. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 states, No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Relying on this clause, the United States Supreme Court held in 1844, Gwynn versus Breedlove, that creditors are entitled to demand and be paid in gold or silver. In other words, until 1933, U.S. paper currency was as good as gold, or as good as silver. We were on a bimetal standard. And by the way, this clause in the U.S. Constitution has never been amended. This means that all the paper money that you're carrying around, all this money that's being created by the Fed, is unconstitutional and illegal, because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And this clause on what money is, on the definition of money in the Constitution, has never been amended. And the Constitution is supposed to be the supreme law of the land. But we went off the gold standard anyway. Now, the big advantage of paper currency, the reason paper currency was created, is it's a lot more convenient, a lot easier for people to conduct daily transactions. Much easier than carrying gold and silver coins around. So the Federal Reserve's job, as envisioned in 1913 when the law was passed, was that the Fed would be issuing new currency at calibrated levels in accordance with population growth to keep the price of gold at $20.67 per ounce, as measured by the dollar. But on April 5th, 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, issued Executive Order 6102 that ordered that all gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates be brought to a Federal Reserve Bank branch in exchange for paper money that did not have the words gold certificate on the paper. People would be paid $20.67 per ounce of gold per Roosevelt's executive order. This executive order was made under the authority of a law enacted in 1917 during World War I called the Trading with the Enemy Act. And this law is still on the books today. And anyone who did not turn in their gold per Roosevelt's executive order could be imprisoned. And some were. Then on January 30, 1934, Congress passed and Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act, which formally outlawed private ownership of gold. And this law, very important, increased the price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, thus devaluing the dollar by 41% overnight. This means that 41% of the American people's wealth was effectively stolen by the U.S. government, stolen by a stroke of Roosevelt's pen, a theft that intensified and prolonged the Great Depression. Now, until then, by the way, the Great Depression was not thought to be a Great Depression. It was thought to be a recession like many other recessions, a kind of a routine recession. It was this act by Roosevelt, confiscating 41% of people's money instantly by decree, that turned what was thought to be a kind of a severe but normal recession into the Great Depression that would last for 10 years. This act by Roosevelt and his Congress destroyed people's confidence in America's economic system. And this set the precedent for going off the gold standard completely in 1971. And isn't it interesting that the Federal Reserve was created and then the Great Depression happened? What? Huh? America was told that the Federal Reserve would stabilize the banking system and stabilize the economy. Seems to have done the opposite. Remember, throughout the 19th century America and up until 1913, banks just issued their own currency, their own dollars in the form of gold or silver certificates. America's money system was very decentralized, mostly state-chartered and local community banks. There were federally chartered banks as well, mostly in the cities. But there wasn't really an approval process for banks. Pretty much anyone could set one up. Anyone could set up a bank. Banks just had to abide by the U.S. Coinage Act of 1792. This law established what legal money is. Coins had to have the correct amount of gold and silver. Banks could then issue gold or silver certificates, redeemable for gold or silver coins on demand. And banks were required to hold gold and silver reserves backing these gold and silver certificates. And remember, under the Coinage Act of 1792, counterfeiting and fraud were death penalty offenses. That's how you regulate money and banking. You make punishments for fraud and for counterfeiting severe. And yes, there still will be some fraud. But the fact that issuing fraudulent currency was a death penalty offense kept fraud to a minimum. Pushed by Alexander Hamilton, the United States did establish a temporary national bank in 1791, and this national bank, pushed by Hamilton, was strongly opposed by both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Thomas Jefferson believed that the strength of the United States was its decentralized political and economic structure. Decentralized financial and political power is a key pillar of protecting liberty. James Madison, who wrote most of the Constitution, believed that a national bank was a violation of the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, and other clauses as well. Unfortunately, George Washington backed Hamilton's proposal, so Hamilton's national bank narrowly passed the Congress, I think by 1 vote. However, the purpose of Hamilton's bank was not to set monetary policy. It was very different from the monstrosity that is the United States Federal Reserve. Very different from the creature from Jekyll Island. The purpose of the bank basically was to help the fledgling United States deal with its debts from the Revolutionary War, collect duties and tariffs, and just generally enable the new federal government to function. But alarming to many was that Hamilton's national bank was set up as a quasi-private entity. People could invest in this bank, including foreign investors. But the Treasury Department could inspect the books of this national bank, could do audits, which is very different from the United States Federal Reserve, where Congress is literally forbidden by law from auditing the Federal Reserve. That's right, Congress is forbidden by law from auditing the Federal Reserve. I mean, what the F? So the Fed really is accountable to no one. Hamilton's national bank could also issue currency in the form of gold and silver certificates, just like any bank could, under the Coinage Act. Also, under the Coinage Act, anybody could bring their gold and silver to a branch of the U.S. Mint and have it melted down into gold or silver coins. The U.S. Mint branch would check the gold and the silver for purity and so forth. Hamilton's national bank was called the First National Bank, and it lasted only until 1812, then was dissolved due to constitutional objections. And people didn't like that there was too much foreign ownership of the bank. And there was just a general distrust of banking in America, especially big banks, and especially a national bank. In 1816, 5 years after Hamilton's national bank was dissolved, Congress did establish a second national bank of the United States. But President Andrew Jackson dissolved this national bank in 1833. And Thomas Jefferson in 1816 lamented that the U.S. Constitution had not adequately addressed corruption of the money, corruption of banking, and the piling up of debt, national debt, to be paid by future generations. Here's what Jefferson wrote in a letter to his close friend John Taylor. Quote, "This system of banking I contemplated as a blot left on all of our constitutions, which, if not covered, will end in their destruction. And I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies." That was Thomas Jefferson. So yes, Thomas Jefferson was very much opposed to any kind of national bank. I agree with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Good job, President Andrew Jackson, for dissolving it. Besides, we don't want a national bank that will compete with local banks. What we want with banks and everything else is free market competition, which always produces the best products and services. What we want government to be is a neutral referee, enforcing laws and rules. The government is not supposed to be an active player in the game, and we should certainly not have a national bank. So in the 19th century, our economy was very decentralized. In 1900, there were more than 10,000 banks in operation for a population of 76 million. Today, we just have a few big banks for a population of 340 million. Pretty much gone is the local community bank. Up until 1913, individual banks had the authority to issue their own paper dollars in the form of gold or silver certificates. The only requirement being that they had to actually have gold and silver on hand in reserve to back up these gold and silver certificates. Or it was a death penalty offense. And this was a system that worked pretty well for the most part. In fact, the United States prior to the Civil War was a stunning economic success. So much so that French writer and statesman Alexis de Tocqueville traveled to America in the 1830s to find out what was making the United States such an economic powerhouse so quickly. And basically, the answer was freedom and decentralization. That's what de Tocqueville reported. There was almost no central government in America to speak of in the 19th century, before the Civil War. Yet the United States of America was flourishing economically. So much so that the world wanted to come here. And Tocqueville wrote about what he saw in his 2-volume classic, Democracy in America. That's what life in America was like without a central bank, or much of a central government at all. Then the Federal Reserve System was established in 1913. the creature from Jekyll Island. Then FDR confiscated 41% of people's money with a stroke of a pen by changing the price of gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce, and also outlawing the private ownership of gold. But at least the price of gold remained at $35 per ounce until President Richard Nixon took the United States off the gold standard completely in 1971. 1971 marks the year when we started to see the middle class in America slowly disappear. The creation of the Fed served no benefit, the Fed being the government's massive money printing and counterfeiting operation. All that was needed was the Coinage Act of 1792 that set the price of gold at $19.39 an ounce and established counterfeiting as a death penalty offense. Anyone could issue their own gold or silver certificates. Anyone could set up a bank. You just couldn't do counterfeiting. You couldn't engage in fraud or death penalty. And the American economy boomed for more than a century under this decentralized economic structure. Now, the 19th century was not without problems. We had a civil war, for example, a second war with the British Empire, the War of 1812. But aside from all that, America was the place where the world wanted to go to. The world saw America in the 19th century as a place where the streets were paved with gold, as the land of infinite opportunity. And we didn't have the Fed. We didn't have infinite money printing by government. Didn't have a $35 trillion national debt, soon to be $100 trillion. And our government really doesn't care at all about the national debt. Our politicians don't care, in both parties, because the government know that it can just keep printing more and more money to cover the interest payments on the national debt. Well, at least for a while, until we become the German Weimar Republic, which produced Adolf Hitler. So things like that happen when you have dishonest money. And I really see no way out of this money printing regime, which will just continue to accelerate. We have a $35 trillion national debt now. But in 2019, the national debt was $19 trillion. So we've almost doubled our national debt in a bit more than 4 years. So I'm seeing a $100 trillion national debt by 2032. Obviously, this is unsustainable. But this happens to all nations and empires eventually. No nation, no empire has been able to resist the temptation of the money printing press. And this eventually leads to the collapse of the nation, the empire, or the civilization. If you ask people on the street where they think money comes from, most will say money comes from the government. But that's not true. Gold and silver were not created by the government. Money emerged naturally on its own through trial and error. People have tried using all kinds of things for money. Tried using seashells, pretty stones. You can use baseball cards for money. But gold and silver work the best. Gold and silver were not created by government, but were discovered thousands of years ago by ordinary people as useful for transmitting value in exchange for goods and services. Both gold and silver have been used as money for at least 4,000 years. But money was nationalized by governments starting around 600 BC. Governments wanted to control the money. Government, most notably the Roman Empire, needed money to fund expansion of the empire, needed money to fund war. As the Roman Empire spread and became very expensive to maintain, the government in Rome had to debase the currency in order to pay its soldiers and fund its war machine. So instead of silver coins, the Roman government started paying its soldiers with diluted coins. At first, the soldiers didn't notice, but eventually the debasement of the coins was so total that the soldiers could wipe the silver finish off the coins with their thumbs. Many Roman soldiers rebelled out of being cheated out of their pay and joined the barbarian hordes that were invading the empire. So the Roman Empire collapsed. This was followed by 800 years of dark ages. No civilization. This is where debasement of the money leads. It can lead to Adolf Hitler, Venezuela, or any number of horrible outcomes. The only way the government can fund war and bigger government is by debasing the currency, for the simple reason that people won't put up with taxes going higher and higher. If we had honest money, we would have fewer wars. Government having the power to print all the money it wants fuels war, actually incentivizes war. Have you noticed that the United States is always at war with someone? When one war ends, another war starts. Government fiat money printing equals more war. So government fiat money printing systems always impose a hidden tax called inflation that people don't notice that much at first, at least for a while, until the inflation is out of control, which usually happens suddenly. Debasement of the money always eventually leads to the collapse of economies and political systems. This is why I see Bitcoin as the only way out of this mess, at least for us as individuals. Bitcoin is the Second Amendment for your money. This is not investment advice. I don't give investment advice. And frankly, I don't know if Bitcoin is enough of a life raft to survive complete civilizational collapse. We will see soon. But I'll summarize for you the reason for Bitcoin and why I think Bitcoin is vastly superior to gold as protection for your money, both against the government's fiat money printing press, but also as protection against government outright seizing your money. Because if you have your money in a bank or any financial institution, government can get it. In fact, banks are agents of the government. I'm not going to get into much detail here about how Bitcoin works. I've written a book on this. I've also put up many videos on this topic on my channel here. But the big problem that Bitcoin was designed to fix was the problem of dishonest money, the problem of the government's fiat money printing press, and to guard against the danger of the government seizing your money. Bitcoin is the only money network in the world that is not owned or controlled by anyone or by any small group. Bitcoin allows you to transact with anyone in the world without going through a middleman, such as a bank, or a credit card company, or a third-party payment processor like PayPal, or Apple Pay. With Bitcoin, transactions are peer-to-peer. What is peer-to-peer? Well, if you are carrying cash and you want to buy something in a store on the street that you happen to be passing by, you can just pull out your cash and buy the item. That's a peer-to-peer transaction. There's no middleman. You don't need to go through a credit card company or a bank to complete the transaction. But until Bitcoin, there was no way to buy anything remotely without going through a credit card company or a third-party payment processor or some kind of a middleman. Bitcoin cuts out the middleman and allows you to transmit or receive value from anyone in the world without a credit card company, without a middleman. Also, with Bitcoin, you don't need a bank or any kind of third-party institution to store your money. With Bitcoin, you are your own bank. Pay no attention to the other crypto assets. About 30,000 of them have sprung up in the wake of Bitcoin's stunning success. 99% of them are outright scams. The few others that are not outright scams are either fatally flawed, do not address the problem of dishonest money, or are centralized projects under the control of humans. Bitcoin is the only crypto asset out there that actually solves the problem of dishonest money. It's the first, the best, and by far the biggest. It's a $1.4 trillion asset as I speak these words to you here. There are more than 400 million users worldwide. Bitcoin solves the problem of dishonest money by removing humans from the governance of the money. Bitcoin separates money from government. Bitcoin automates the issuance of the money. Bitcoin operates in accordance with a fixed set of rules that can never change. And the most important rule of Bitcoin is that there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins for 8 billion people. Bitcoin is money in the form of a synchronized ledger of transactions that is updated and distributed every 10 minutes to a worldwide network of more than 1 million mining computers and validating nodes. The job of the miners is to process transactions and to guard the network. The job of the validating nodes is to oversee the work of the miners. And the miners receive Bitcoin for their work. That's why it's called a proof-of-work mining system. And the miners have a strong incentive to protect the security of the Bitcoin network, because by protecting the Bitcoin network, they are protecting their own Bitcoin, which they are working so hard to earn. Plus, all transactions are public and can be seen by everyone in the world live and in real time. It's a completely transparent ledger. Only the identity of the transactors are hidden by code. Bitcoin is also protected by 2 layers of SHA-256 cryptography. SHA-256 cryptography was developed by the NSA to protect America's military computer networks. Bitcoin is also protected by its decentralized structure, and there are many other layers of protection. Bitcoin has now been in existence since 2009. The underlying Bitcoin technology has never been hacked. Elon Musk says the Bitcoin network is unhackable. Now, people have lost their Bitcoins by being careless. Either they lost their private key code, or they lost their Bitcoin by allowing a thief to get their private key code. And crypto exchanges have been hacked, which is why you should not leave your Bitcoin on an exchange. You should self-custody your Bitcoin. One of the big points of Bitcoin is that you are your own bank. You don't have to trust a third-party institution to secure your Bitcoin. And with SHA-256 cryptography, there are more possibilities for private key codes than there are atoms in the known universe. So your Bitcoin is secure so long as you guard your private key code. Some have called Bitcoin digital gold, which is a pretty good description because Bitcoin possesses many of the properties of gold. But in my view, Bitcoin also possesses properties that make it vastly superior to gold. For one thing, gold is not easily transportable. Try sending your gold bar overseas, or carrying your gold bar through an airport or across a border. That would be tough. With Bitcoin, you can send any amount of money anywhere in the world with a few keystrokes on your phone, and you don't need approval from a bank. With Bitcoin, you can carry your wealth in your head if you can remember a 12-word phrase, or if you can write that phrase on a piece of paper. Gold is easily confiscated. Bitcoin is unconfiscatable money because you don't have to store it in a bank or any financial institution. And you can transact directly with people peer-to-peer on your phone without going through any financial institution. With Bitcoin, you are your own bank. So Bitcoin is not only unconfiscatable, it is uncensorable money, meaning no one can stop your transactions. No one can stop you from paying someone, and no one can stop you from getting paid. In fact, Bitcoin eliminates the need for banks. I started buying Bitcoin in 2019. Bitcoin is my insurance against economic and political system collapse. If all hell breaks loose here, Wanda and I can escape with a good portion of our wealth in Bitcoin. And no one will know we're carrying our wealth. We just need the clothes we're wearing and we're out of here when the collapse happens. Now, I hope I don't have to escape with a few hours' notice, but Bitcoin allows us to if we need to. And meanwhile, Bitcoin protects our wealth from the government's fiat money printer. And Bitcoin is better than real estate for many of the same reasons. We actually do own many rental properties. We're probably going to get rid of those soon. But Bitcoin serves a different purpose. The problem with real estate is it's not transportable. You can't move it. Property taxes are always going up, as are insurance costs. There are also maintenance costs, plus tenants who don't pay their rent. And then it's very difficult to evict non-paying tenants. Owning real estate is really pretty close to a full-time job. Again, I'm not trying to sell you on Bitcoin. I don't give investment advice. I'm just telling you what I do to protect my wealth from government attack, whether it's the government's fiat money printing press or outright confiscation by government, which happens all the time. That's why I call Bitcoin the Second Amendment for my money. I'll bet Donald Trump wishes he had a lot of his wealth in Bitcoin right now and not tied up in skyscrapers and real estate in Manhattan. No one knows who created Bitcoin. Bitcoin is really a miracle of computer engineering. Bitcoin was launched on January 3rd, 2009 by a computer engineer who went by the pseudonymous name, a fake name, of Satoshi Nakamoto. Bitcoin's inventor might have been one person, but I think Bitcoin was invented by a group of brilliant pro-freedom software engineers who had been working on the Bitcoin project for many years, and really for more than a decade. If you'd like to learn more about what Bitcoin is, how Bitcoin works, and the history of Bitcoin, check out my book on Bitcoin. It's available on Amazon and in all the formats. It's also on Audible as an audiobook.